The most widespread translation of the Bible during the early church period was the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, along with a translation of the New Testament and a few books from the Apocrypha. It is really a collection of translations from many scholars compiled over the course of about a century. However, the origin has taken on a legendary status. It is said that 72 scholars, 6 from each tribe of Israel, were sent to Alexandria to translate the Old Testament into Greek. The number is rounded down to 70, and the Roman numerals LXX is used to signify the Septuagint. One story that has survived the centuries is that the 72 scholars all worked independently on the Old Testament, and when they finished and compared their work, all were found to be exactly the same. I'm afraid that this story is not historically verifiable, but was used to argue that the Septuagint was just as inspired as the original Hebrew texts. A helpful and scholarly article for more in-depth knowledge of the Septuagint can be found at the web address on the screen. In the Roman Empire, Greek was the language of scholars and of trade. However, as most people in the Roman Empire did not travel, there were many in the western portion that did not speak Greek, whereas the Septuagint became the standard version to use in the Greek-speaking world. The Latin-speaking portion then translated the Septuagint into Latin. There were various translations that were used, and no one became standard until the time of Jerome. He began his work of translating Hebrew directly into Latin. His translation became known as the Vulgate and became the standard Bible translation that the Roman Catholic branch of the Church used for centuries. The word Vulgate means common and is where the English language gets the word for vulgar. Now, it is important to note that the term vulgar did not mean bad-mannered, uncouth, discourteous, unrefined, and rude. It simply meant common, as in everyday. The Vulgate was to be a translation for the everyman, one that could be read by every Latin-speaking person. When Jerome published his finished work, it was not as well received as he had hoped. Many, including Augustine of Hippo, accused Jerome of changing the scriptures without authorization. Many breaches formed between Jerome and other leaders, most of which would not heal by the time Jerome died. Augustine and Jerome did reconcile due to being on the same side when it came to the Pelagian debate. Jerome relied on Augustine's work, and the two managed to get along. Returning to the subject of scripture translation, what Jerome and the church ran into was the problem of the game of telephone. Whereas the previous Latin translations relied on the Greek version, Jerome worked directly from the original Hebrew. Thus, some changes should be expected. One aspect that can alter the way texts are translated is what scholars call dynamic and literal translations. Dynamic translations try to capture the same overall thought of a sentence, whereas literal translations are concerned with getting each word technically correct in the new language. Examples of this today in English are the New Living Translation and the English Standard Version. The NLT is a more dynamic translation, and the ESV is a more literal translation. There are more extreme versions on both ends of the spectrum. This is what Jerome ran into with the reception of the Vulgate. What approach was he using, and what were the approaches of other Latin translators? Eventually, of course, the Vulgate was recognized as an excellent translation, and its use spread over the entire Latin-speaking world. When Martin Luther, during the Reformation of the 1500s, advocated for the scriptures in people's common language, his actions harkened back to Jerome. Ironically, what was considered the best translation for use by the Church, according to the Roman Catholic branch, was a corrupted version of the Vulgate. Before moving on to the Pelagian controversy, I need to pause at this point to clarify several things. First, I am not advocating for any particular Bible translation. Second, that what I am about to say regarding the Pelagian controversy can be taken out of context. The Pelagian controversy involves the question of free will, and I do not want this to cause any arguments within the body, as it has done so many times in the past. My goal with this lesson is simply to present the arguments of both sides, and I do not advocate for either side in this video. My personal views on this matter I wish to keep to myself, as it will add nothing significant nor helpful. Also, this presentation will be brief. There are many volumes devoted to this subject, and I would encourage lengthy reading on both sides of the argument before coming to a conclusion. Finally, I will say that there are 2 or 3 people that I know that I will have this debate with. I know these people extremely well, and when we do discuss this, it is always in a good-natured way. We do not break fellowship over this issue, even though we disagree. If you wish to debate the question of free will, I would encourage you to find someone that you can comfortably discuss with without the danger of having a breach. That being said, I will now begin by giving the background information for the debate. Pelagius was a monk from Britain that saw the Christian life as one that could overcome sin by constant effort, as there was no original sin and God made people with free will. Children, he argued, have no sin until, with their free will, they decide to sin. Pelagius further argued that God commanding people to obey the law and Jesus' command to be holy as God is holy imply that such commands can be carried out. Otherwise, he would not have commanded them. Pelagius did agree with Augustine that the source of evil was in the will of people. Where Pelagius disagreed was that he believed people always have the ability to overcome their sin. Otherwise, sin would be excusable as people would be powerless against it. Augustine, the bishop of Hippo in Egypt, argued from his personal experience that there was a time when he both willed to become a Christian and willed not to become a Christian. This meant that the will was more complicated than Pelagius said. Augustine argued there was original sin passed down from Adam and Eve throughout humanity. Thus, sin is present in all people, and the human will is at times powerless against sin. It is only by divine intervention that a person can choose not to sin. In Augustine's view, before the fall, man was free to sin and not sin, but after the fall, man has only a choice of evils. When people are redeemed, the grace of God works in people, leading their will from the state of sin to one in which freedom is restored. So, now Christians are free both to sin and not sin. Augustine further argued that it is God that initiates salvation, as the human will is powerless against sin, and that only those who are predestined to receive grace will be redeemed. These are the arguments that Augustine and Pelagius present. Eventually, Pelagianism was rejected by the wider church, more on the grounds that Pelagius rejected the teachings of original sin. Most of the church could agree that there was original sin present and even observable in infants. This does not mean the wider church was enthusiastic about Augustine's views. His views on predestination and irresistible grace were rejected, and his works were reinterpreted over a course of a century. Thus, there were people later who claimed to be Augustinian and people who were semi-Pelagian. The Synod of Orange in 529 would uphold Augustine's views on the primacy of grace in conversion, but left aside the consequences of that doctrine. This reinterpretation also helped Augustine to be the most influential theologian for the next 800 years, until the time of Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s. Despite the church not widely agreeing with his views during the Pelagian debate, Augustine would become the most widely quoted theologian among both Roman Catholics and Protestants, as his writings were a favorite of Luther, Calvin, and others. Augustine's 2 most popular books, Confessions and The City of God, still survive today, and you can find them for free online. I know that many theologians, including Ravi Zacharias, use them and quote from them today. By 378, the emperor had died in battle against the Goths. Then in 410, the city of Rome was sacked by the Goths, led by Alaric. Then came Attila and his Huns, and then other peoples that conquered portions of what was the Western Roman Empire. The eastern half of the empire, with its capital in Constantinople, would continue for another 1,000 years. But for Western Europe, the stability that the Roman Empire had brought was over. It would take centuries for both the infrastructure as well as the culture to be rebuilt. Over the years, the church became the guardian of knowledge and of law and order. When the Roman Empire When the empire was resurrected in the West, after centuries, it was done by the actions of the Pope. How the Pope and the Church became so powerful was a long process. The age in which they governed is known as the Middle Ages. This will be the subject in my next series of videos.